water.
This is episode 216 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am pleased to be joined for this week's interview with Lisa Conyers. She is author of a new book, Welfare for the Rich: How Your Tax Dollars End Up in Millionaires' Pockets and What You Can Do About It. Welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Lisa.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks to the foundation for hosting this also.
Yeah, well, you have been out to New Mexico for a Rio Grande Foundation event a couple years ago, and so you're a little familiar with New Mexico, and you have this new book out, which is kind of right up our alley in terms of where we try to address some of the government spending issues in our state. It's theoretically lowest hanging fruit is some of the spending that happens that goes counter to the progressive playbook, supposedly, of helping the lowest income, the neediest people. And what winds up seemingly happening is that government actually pads the bottom lines of major businesses and others who have already, quote unquote, made it, and does that at the expense of the rest of us. So talk a little bit about, kind of the broad outline of your book, and you have a co-author with regard to this piece of work, which is Phil Harvey. But what are you trying to get to in terms of this book?
Okay, well, so I was in New Mexico and did an event with you guys, which was all about our previous book, which was a book on the welfare system. And when we were doing that book, I was looking at federal spending and state spending on welfare programs. And more than one person said, hey, well, why don't you look at corporate welfare? Essentially, our tax dollars that go to very wealthy people, because there sure is an awful lot of that. And it's always been, a perennial hot topic and something that we've been interested in and unhappy about. So we thought after tackling the welfare system, we'd tackle essentially another welfare system in our country. And the wealthy don't tend to want you to call it corporate welfare. They want to call it, incentives to do more business or whatever. But it comes down to the same thing. It comes down to your tax dollars leaving your pocket, going into the coffers of state and federal legislators, and then they spend it and give it to people that we just don't think really need it. And people like to say that they're big believers in free markets, and a lot of these people are the same people that are perfectly happy to take subsidies from the federal government and take tax breaks and zoning breaks and regulation breaks and tariff breaks and whatever they can get to sort of pad their pockets at the expense of us taxpayers. So that's what led to the book. And I did this book much like I did the last one. There was a lot of travel around the country looking for interesting stories and digging up examples that we could use, because we didn't just want big, huge federal examples. We wanted to show that it wasn't only a national problem, but it was also very much a local problem. And actually, that's what led me to New Mexico, makes it into the book in our film subsidies section, which is a big one for your state.
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit about kind of the underlying premises, and you have already explained at least some of it. Mm-hmm. We've got federal programs, and there's a lot of those, and those are things that the Rio Grande Foundation is concerned about, but there's a lot of organizations in Washington, D.C. working on those federal issues. And then you have state issues, of course. That is our bread and butter here at the Rio Grande Foundation. It's really one of the big things that we work on. Film subsidies, you certainly mentioned it. But before we get into kind of the New Mexico specific stuff, talk a little bit about some of the big problems in Washington programs. I know you mentioned the farm programs and agriculture. Those are things that have been in place since the Roosevelt administration, FDR, and
Mhm.
seem to grow and expand and get worse and worse over time. What other programs, and if you want to talk about farm programs and what those mean as well, certainly anything you want to talk about is great. But there's obviously a lot of these kinds of programs in Washington, D.C., and what are the ones that you're
Sure.
more concerned about than the others?
Yeah. Well, this actually started very much by looking at the farm subsidy program because it's just so huge and it affects, it's big dollars and it's been going on so long. And it's one of those programs that, like many in Washington, is so hard to get rid of because it's so ingrained. And the thing about the farm subsidy program is that it's tied to the food stamp program. And the only reason it gets passed every 4 years is because, you know, the Congress can say, oh, well, we can't possibly get rid of the food stamp program. And oh, by the way, agricultural subsidies are tied to the same farm bill. So that it's most farmland is now corporate farmland, or big ag farmland is covered by the ag subsidies, which is crazy because the average farmer makes double what the average American makes, and there are lots and lots of millionaire farmers who are getting subsidies, and it just doesn't really make a lot of sense. And I think what I can say about all of these programs is that if you're a millionaire or a billionaire, why do you need our tax dollars at all? No matter what you're doing, we believe in free markets. Sure, run a big ag, farm, run a media company that's making movies, do whatever you'd like, but don't ask us taxpayers to fund it. So, big ag is a big one. The whole tariff situation, especially under this administration, has been a real problem because people have argued and lobbied for certain subsidies or certain tariffs on certain products but not on others. And so it's a very patchwork system of who can lobby in Congress and who can get a special deal so that their products are cheaper than something that's imported. Or we could,
Now,
yeah, go
tariff
ahead.
is a serious issue, and but I want to get some specifics in the agriculture program because I used to work at the National Taxpayers Union in Washington, D.C., and that's getting on 15 years now. But of course, these issues with regard to the agriculture program loomed large back in those days as well. And as I said, it goes back to the Great Depression and FDR and the New Deal. What can you throw at us any specific horror stories or things that you found particularly egregious in regard to the agriculture programs in this country? Because I remember in my days in Washington, we would work with even environmental groups that we might agree on just those issues.
Mm-hmm.
We actually tried those left-right coalitions to get reform for the ag bill and get some of these most egregious subsidy programs and in their case, most environmentally destructive programs reformed or eliminated.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, when you talk about agricultural working with across the aisle on various issues. I mean, one issue in the farm bill system is this whole thing of putting land into conservation easements, where you tell the government you're going to put this much of your acreage, let it lay fallow and not grow on it. And then you get a subsidy you get paid to not grow crops. So I'm sure that's one that you probably worked on, changing, because a lot of times it was land that they weren't going to be able to farm anyway, or it was, or that they had no intention of farming for the next few years because they were going to let it sit anyway. So that's one that just, I mean, it reaches pretty absurd proportions.
To reduce your property taxes significantly. Is that the major giveaway there?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You don't have to pay property taxes, or in fact, you can get paid to not grow crops. I mean, you can actually get a subsidy for not growing on that land. Um, so that's one. The other thing that really frustrates me about the whole farm bill is that it funds the biggest. We mostly fund corn and sorghum and wheat and all of these big major crops, and we don't subsidize vegetables or fruits or nuts, things that are healthy for us. And a study recently came out that said if you eat mostly what's subsidized in America, you're probably more likely to be obese and have high blood pressure and really bad health. So if the idea behind subsidizing American farmers is so that we're all getting fed, well, we're not doing a very good job of feeding ourselves healthy foods. So that's another frustration. And then the other one is that, we used to believe, or we used to think that all this stuff that we were growing was going to feed us, but that's really not the case anymore. For example, 90% of corn is not eaten by us. It's either turned into ethanol, or it's exported, or it's used as feed. So a lot of, the romantic notions that we have about farm subsidies in America just aren't very accurate anymore.
And ethanol, is that in your book? Because that's one that
Oh,
seems just a complete boondoggle giveaway. Bad for the environment, yet again.
yeah.
Talk a little
Bad
bit.
for the environment, bad for engines, unless you have brand new equipment. It's bad for, I mean, I met a lot of farmers that are running, farm equipment that's, 10, 15 years old. And they tell me just horror stories of how bad it is for their engines, and they're like, well, I'm stuck. I have to buy it, but I don't want to use it because I mean, I'm not a mechanic, but apparently they're not real happy about that part of it either. But and the only reason ethanol is where it is today in terms of our consumption is because of it's so heavily subsidized. I mean, I met a lot of farmers who said, well, I sure as heck would not be growing this unless I was getting subsidized. So we're actually incentivizing bad behavior, which is always a bad idea.
Yeah, no doubt. And we could talk agriculture subsidies alone all day, but
Yeah.
real quickly, New Mexico does have its share of agriculture. A lot of it's ranching.
Mm-hmm.
We're not one of the states that gets a lot of these federal dollars, these welfare programs for ag subsidies and whatnot. Those tend to go to, as you say, the corn producing states and the big, open prairies there
Mm-hmm.
in the Midwest. And yet the politicians, the senators, the members of the House of Representatives from New Mexico tend to vote for these things and don't really give much thought to reform of agriculture subsidies. Do you think that's because New Mexico is a very dependent state and we get the food stamp situation and that gives them the incentive, or is it just they don't care enough? Why don't states that aren't getting the big subsidy programs, why don't those folks do something about it and try to stand up a little bit for their own constituents?
Well, yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I would say, great, good job, New Mexico, for not not taking a bunch of subsidies and relying on them, right? But I just think that, yeah, I think that there are huge lobbying interests, that are very good at lobbying in Washington for corn and wheat and sorghum and the big ones, and it's really hard to change that. And the frustrating thing is, I mean, I met farmers all over the country that don't get any subsidies, that were trying to do something different, especially small farmers. I mean, small farmers don't get this money. We're talking big ag. And I met a lot of people that were trying to grow, healthy, whether it was meat or fruit or vegetables or whatever, who said they couldn't qualify for anything. They said, yeah, sure, I would take the help. I mean, if you want to help me buy my seed or buy some acreage or whatever, but I've been told that, I can only participate if I, participating like the big boys, and I can't do it. So, I mean, there are crazy ag subsidies. There's one I think it's in Nevada or Arizona where they're growing the certain kind, rye. I think it's rye or some kind of thing that only racehorses eat. And they get subsidized to grow this kind of, hay. I want to say rye, but I don't know if that's right. But most of it is exported to Saudi Arabia because the Saudis love to race their horses. So we're actually subsidizing farmers to grow hay that gets shipped off to Saudi Arabia for racehorses. It sure as hell isn't being used by our, consumers. So that's the kind of stuff that just, makes me crazy.
All right, well, that's just the tip of the iceberg. I know you've got a lot more examples and a lot more specific issues, especially in Washington, D.C., before we turn our attention to New Mexico programs. What are some of the other things that you talk about in your book, Welfare for the Rich? And you can find out more about the book that Lisa's written at the website welfarefortherich.com.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've got 10 chapters on various topics, and it's really interesting because before I started this book, I thought I had a pretty good handle, and you probably think you have a pretty good handle on, where this happens. But I was surprised at how many different ways the wealthy have found a way to game the system. And, tariffs is one that came up pretty early on that I didn't really know much about, and I don't think most Americans knew much about until President Trump came into office and said he's a tariff guy and he's going to start, throwing tariffs at various industries. And what's sad about the tariff system is that a lot of the goods that have high tariffs on them are goods that everyday Americans or the poor need. So what you'll find if you examine the tariff system is that there are really high tariffs on everyday goods like cheaper shoes, school backpacks. Work boots is a weird one where, men's work boots, which are something that only men buy who are actually working in construction or fields like that, have a much higher tariff than women's Italian shoes, or men's dress shoes. iPhones didn't have a tariff for a long time. The tariffs tend to impact the poor. I mean, poor are spending $1,000 to $2,000 a year more than they used to on tariffs, because of course those tariffs aren't paid for by the importer. They're just pushed along to the consumer. So, but meanwhile, the wealthy tend to escape that, and plus they're not spending as much of their income on everyday items. So it really impacts them a lot less. So that's one that was kind of a big eye opener.
So real quickly on the tariffs, because that's a relatively new issue, as we talked about agriculture subsidies. Those have been going on for the better part of a century now.
Yeah.
But these tariffs are relatively new. Now, tariffs have been around for a long time, but Trump has obviously used tariffs in a more aggressive manner than most of his predecessors. Now, that doesn't mean that prior tariffs were particularly great, and I'm sure they had a lot of the same issues as the tariffs that Trump has imposed. But you're saying that essentially Trump has kind of followed the pattern, if you will, in terms of tariffs being applied to less well-connected, less powerful industries, and people who consume those products tend to be at the lower end of the political spectrum, or socioeconomic spectrum, I should say. Is that kind of?
Well, right. Or he's using them to protect his wealthy friends, so that it's two sides to it. There's, the one side where, you punish people and make them, pay a lot more to get their goods into this country. And they tend to be goods that, everyday Americans use, or you use it as a way to, help your buddies that lobby well in whatever industry, whether it's the steel industry or the washing machine business or whatever it is, and say, okay, we will protect your items that you're making here by raising the cost of any that are imported into the country. And that has the same effect, because people who are, suddenly having to buy an American washing machine that's at a higher cost, they want to go buy the cheaper one, but now it's got a tariff on it that's going to raise the price of that machine by a lot. And the wealthy don't really tend to care about the price of the items that they buy as much as somebody who's on a budget does. So, and it's been so haphazard. I think that's probably the most frustrating thing about the tariff situation, is how uneven it's been and how unpredictable. 1 minute there's a tariff on this item, and then somebody lobbies and there's not a tariff on it anymore. So I think people find that, extremely frustrating. And I know that businesses that have been impacted in the industries that Trump has targeted have, just sort of been holding back on big investments because they don't know, how it's all going to turn out in the end. So that's just been a very volatile situation with the tariffs. But the interesting thing about tariffs is that we used to fund our federal government that way. We didn't used to have personal income tax. Tariffs were what funded the federal purse. And long ago, we decided that was a really bad idea because it goes against free markets, and we want everybody to trade with each other. And if you're, arbitrarily throwing tariffs at each other, as a way to, fight with other countries, it's just not a very good system. So long ago, we never abolished them completely, but they certainly, for a long time, played a much smaller role than they play now. So that's, the tariffs are a big one. And then, there's if you want to talk about, professional sports, stadiums is another big one, which tends to be more state, it's more funded by the states, but that's one that's just an ongoing boondoggle, where NFL teams and hockey teams and baseball teams with their multi-million-dollar owners go to states and say, hey, I want you to pay for my stadium, pay for all the roads around it. And states just roll over time after time.
Well, let's talk about stadiums in a minute. Just a personal story, Lisa. So I've been involved and active in politics, and my first efforts involved a stadium issue back in my hometown of Cincinnati, Ohio, when both the Bengals and Reds were looking for money. I worked on a ballot measure campaign to try to stop them, and we had some success with that. But when I went to Washington, D.C., my first paid gig as I went to Capitol Hill was with Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who, of course, is a prominent, well, was a prominent Democrat. But what attracted me to him was that he was in favor of getting rid of a federal tax exemption that gave stadium construction a very specific and significant advantage over other kinds of construction projects. Now, I understand that that was gotten rid of perhaps during the Obama administration, was one of the things that he did. That, is there still federal kind of subsidy situation going on with regard to stadiums, or is it, as you said, a pretty much state and local issue at this point?
I think it's pretty much a state and local issue. I mean, what we looked at mostly was, states that had just especially built newer stadiums and how much, it's just what's amazing to me is that, our book, we tried to cover as many topics related to corporate welfare as we could. We really wanted to show a light on how many different ways we're all getting swindled. But, there are several good books that have come out just about stadiums alone. And I feel like any state that's even considering building one and paying for it should look at all the data and studies that are out there that have proven that they're just never a good idea. They're just, why should us taxpayers, I mean, sure, you want to support your local sports team, awesome. You want to build a stadium, awesome. But do it with your own money. Why are you asking taxpayers to help you out when you're, a multi-million-dollar, baseball team owner? You've got a bunch of wealthy friends that can help you out if you need the money. And it's been done. I mean, San Francisco built their most recent stadium without any public funding, and it was a wonderful stadium, and taxpayers aren't on the hook for it. But meanwhile, other states are, to this day, handing out money to lure teams and get them to come and build stadiums there.
Yeah, I've definitely worked on stadium issues for a better part of my adult life, and I'm a little my sweet spot is 90s and 2000s. I haven't really studied the issue that closely. New Mexico in recent years, but New Mexico is not a big pro sports state, so we really haven't focused on it as much. But the soccer team, it's kind of a junior level to the Major League Soccer. They at least were in the process of getting some taxpayer dollars for a stadium, and COVID-19 came along, and that seems to be on hold, hopefully permanently. But any thoughts, just kind of spitballing here in terms of the stadium issue, is the evolution, and change in pro sports due to the COVID-19? Do you think it'll just put things on hold? Do you think we're in the midst of a sea change here when it comes to stadium construction? Obviously, finances for a lot of governments are not great these days.
Yeah, no, state finances have just really taken a hit with this. And I think we'll continue to see a hit. I mean, I don't even think we've seen the beginning of the economic damage that this whole situation is doing. But yeah, I think that there will be, I mean, since the states are the ones that are primarily funding this kind of stuff, I can see how a lot of those kinds of plans will be put on hold. I certainly hope so. DC just finished a pro soccer stadium that they funded in a big way. And, and the thing is, they just have so much leeway. They can give property tax abatements. They can say they're going to build the roads all around it. They can, do whatever they want. And taxpayers seem to go along with it, just, starry-eyed over the idea of having a pro sports team to cheer for. And, there's a story in my book about Hartford, Connecticut, built themselves a little baseball stadium. It's a beautiful stadium, and they built it for a B team to come and relocate to Hartford. And the city's deficit, and this is pre-COVID, was exactly the amount of the cost that they spent on the stadium. And you just have to think, well, wow, did the taxpayers really want their city to go in the hawk just so that they could have a baseball stadium? And in that case, it was built in a really impoverished part of the town. And the builders tried to convince the city, or, I mean, that's what they sold the city was, oh, there'll be so much construction around there. There'll be new restaurants and new, hotels, and all these people are going to come. Well, nobody wants to come to that part of the city. So it's a very strange stadium to go to because you're in a very, economically depressed part of Hartford. Police surround the stadium during games for safety. And the people that are coming to the games are not from Hartford. They're from other parts of Connecticut. And so it's strange how we seem to have this fascination with professional sports. But I think that with COVID, I mean, everybody's going to be tightening their belts, and hopefully stadiums will be one of the things the first things to go. I mean, we certainly have plenty of them. So,
Right. Well, and just referencing back to your San Francisco point, that is the San Francisco Giants baseball stadium that was almost 100% privately funded. And that is one of the best baseball stadiums in the entire country, Major League Baseball. There's a number of other stadiums, whether you're talking about pro football or kind of the arena sorts of things as well, that were privately funded. So the idea that you can't do it is simply incorrect. But we can talk about stadiums again all day too. But
right, exactly.
These are truly, we're spending in New Mexico approximately $150 million. Now, again, COVID-19, one of the small slivers of light relating to this is that Hollywood is not filming in New Mexico, so we're actually saving some money there. Now, the overall economic activity, the oil price, et cetera, are doing more than enough to damage our economy. But one of the things we're not spending tons of money on is welfare for Hollywood producers, but give it time and they will be back. We're about $150 million annually here in New Mexico when things are really going. So talk about welfare for Hollywood, which is a big issue here in New Mexico.
Oh yeah, well, it's funny because that's how New Mexico made it into this book, was film subsidies, and I interviewed some of the people who are that get spots in films there, and some of the people who place look for venues and stuff in New Mexico, and it's so fascinating to me because New Mexico is beautiful. I mean, the natural beauty, the natural light is just ideal for film, for cinematography. And it's a lot like Hawaii in the same sense of just like this beauty. Of course, people want to film there, and so you have this ideal place to film. They're going to come there anyway, just like they're going to go to Hawaii anyway. They're going to go with or without the subsidies. So the fact that New Mexico, Hawaii, or another example is New York City. I mean, New York City, it's the only place like it in the country. If you're going to do a story about New York City, you're going to New York, whether you get the subsidies for it or not. The Wolves, what was it? The Wolves of Wall Street?
Yep.
Had to be filmed in Wall Street, had to be filmed in New York. They got a massive subsidy from the city to film there, and they would have gone there anyway. So, I think that I think that when filmmaking comes back, New Mexico would be wise to say, well, those guys are going to come back anyway, because we have this beautiful natural beauty there. And, I don't know. It's just one of those things, again, where you just think, well, why do they need our money again to do this? They're going to do it anyway. And yet, I mean, I met one guy in New Mexico who he works with the film industry a lot. And he said, hey, I think it's the best thing in the world for New Mexico. We all get to act in movies, and we get to have Hollywood people come here, and they spend a lot of money on, hotels and restaurants and all that kind of stuff. And he said he wanted to build a production studio on, where New Mexico and Colorado meet, because Colorado has really good subsidies too, so that they could benefit from both states film subsidies and double dip. And I just thought, oh my goodness, the taxpayers of two states getting hit for the same film, But so that's what I would say about that for New Mexico, is look around you at what beautiful, scenery and that you have, and trust me, they're going to come anyway. I mean, that's what I heard from so many filmmakers, that the light in New Mexico is just so perfect for filmmaking. So, but it's a lot of money. And if I can digress a little bit there, talking about taxpayers sort of taking control of this, down in Louisiana, there was a story, and this ended up in my energy chapter because it has to do with Dow and Mobil and all those guys. But since the 1930s, Louisiana has given property tax abatements to all those energy companies that are along the Gulf. And there was a local activist group that said, why are our schools ranked the last? Our health, how are kids doing school, all this stuff. Why are we so behind everybody else? And they started looking into it and discovered this tax break that all those big energy companies were getting. And it was just sort of a rubber stamp thing. There was this little commission nobody had ever heard of that was part of the legislator, and they assigned 5 guys to basically rubber stamp these applications from energy companies. And So they lobbied really hard, and they managed to change the law last year so that now when those energy companies want those property tax abatements, they have to justify why to the local school districts, the local fire departments, and the local police departments, who can all say to them, hey, but if you did pay your fair share, we'd all be in better shape here in Louisiana. So I would say the same thing could happen with film subsidies is, make those Hollywood guys have to answer to, your local service, your local, people that provide your basic services, and, tell the fire department why they're not going to get their piece. Tell the school district why they don't need their, why they should be subsidizing that kind of program.
Well, let me kind of play the devil's advocate for a second, but also kind of tease a few details out. So in New Mexico, we actually cut checks to Hollywood, and that's the state doing that. Now, you talked about double dipping in the area of film. There is plenty of double dipping going on, and that is local governments or the state of New Mexico through the capital outlay process have actually written checks to fund, or tax exemptions have been given to fund studios that have cropped up around New Mexico to take advantage of the film subsidies. So there's that double dipping going on right there. So I know in the Four Corners, $1 million was put into a capital outlay bill, but also in Santa Fe Studios had money given to them by the local government. Now, that is something that we're very concerned about, very frustrated by. We want to stop it immediately. Now, you talk about Louisiana and energy companies, and like I said, Hollywood is writing checks. You talk about the energy companies in Louisiana, and they're not paying taxes. Now, you identify as a libertarian, I assume, right, Lisa?
Yeah, and libertarian leaning independent.
Fair enough. Well, in some form of libertopia, if you will, there would be no taxes or very small amounts of taxes. Now, I'm not saying I agree with this concept, but how do you kind of weigh the differences and pluses and minuses of offering tax breaks for whatever business or industry, as opposed to outright subsidies in the way you write a check? Because this is something that we kind of constantly are dealing with, is that it can be dubious. It's questionable, certainly, whether tax incentives are used, and those are used all the time across the country. But when government's actually collecting our taxes and then doling it out to various businesses, that's where we really draw the line for sure. So look at that kind of distinction.
Well, I guess I've heard that argument before, that they're sort of different, but at the same time, if you're letting somebody not pay some kind of tax, like a property tax or an income tax or whatever, that you still have the same budget, or maybe you have a smaller budget because you have less money to work with. And so, if some big industry is not paying their fair share, well, then everybody else has to take on the load. And that tends to be the everyday taxpayer who can't walk into Washington and say, hey, I don't want to pay my taxes. Is that okay? And get away with it. So there's that. And then there's a writing a check. But if you're writing a check, it's the same thing, though, because you're actually writing a check, and it's money that somebody else is going to have to cover. So it's coming from somewhere, and it's coming from the taxpayer. So whether it's, something that somebody never pays in the first place, like a property tax, or whether it's something where they're getting a check written to them, that money is all money that is being covered by the taxpayer. And that's where, I would argue that that's one of the better arguments for libertarianism and smaller government, because, the less government, programs, less money we give government, the less likely they're going to do to give it away in ways that seem frivolous, such as giving it to millionaires and billionaires who don't really need it. And so of all the argument, and the thing is, libertarians are very free market, right? And so we do believe in free markets, but what we're looking at when we see this is it's not a free market. If somebody's getting a break and somebody else can't get that break, and if somebody's not paying their fair share of taxes, that's a problem. That's not a balanced playing field that everybody can play on equally. So, I guess that's the way I would look at that. And, as far as libertarianism and taxes, I think that even a staunch libertarian would say, well, we should pay taxes on certain, we do, we do expect some things from our federal and state governments. We're not opposed to, all spending. We certainly want a police force of some kind, although now there are big arguments about what that should look like. We certainly want, fire departments. We certainly want, well, some would argue whether we should be funding school systems, but again, that gets into a different kind of political argument. But, I think basic services should be funded. And if we only funded those basic services, roads and things like that, and we didn't have all this extra money, we wouldn't be giving it away.
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything that you're saying. I would just, I think the difference between cutting checks and tax exemptions is more significant due to the dynamic of how much economic activity is required for the government to get the tax revenue in, because, you're taxing it. Here in New Mexico, the state's tax on gross receipts is 5.125%. So you have to do $100 of activity in order to get 51 cents of tax revenue. And then when you're cutting checks for $150 million, it's a lot more potent of a subsidy than exempting $150 million of activity from taxation. I'm not saying that we support or that we would encourage government to provide tax incentives across the board. But I would also say that, when you are discussing tax issues, there are always concerns about, is this a broad-based tax policy or is this a tax subsidy? And creating that difference and showing that it's just not a tax subsidy when you have a broad-based tax policy, it just gets pretty difficult to explain to policymakers and the general public, because they'll say, oh, it's a subsidy because you cut taxes. Well, we cut taxes on everybody. Mm-hmm. And I know that's something we understand, but it gets pretty tough to explain to policymakers, I guess.
Yeah, it does for sure. And it certainly is a complex issue. And, I just tend to look at it as like, whose hands in my pocket right now? Wait, okay, they don't have their hands in my pocket, but they want me to pull out my checkbook. That's a very simplistic way to look at it.
State and local tax or expenditure issues, subsidies that you see as really problematic. And if you will, these are regressive policies. These are policies that rob from the poor and middle class and give to the rich. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of economic development policies here in New Mexico and across the country that are highly problematic as well.
Oh yeah, I mean, I don't know, you can give me an example from New Mexico, but, I think whenever state or local governments are being told, oh, it's going to create all this economic development and economic activity. I was in Indiana, and this little town had really invested heavily in this whole new, Riverside redevelopment project with apartments and retail and blah, blah, blah. And you just have to, and they just kept saying, we're going to bring jobs, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. But it was all really wealthy people that were involved in it. And the question just kept coming up, well, why do you need our money to do it? I mean, why is it so important for you don't have enough money, or do you have enough money? Why are you asking for us? And they don't want to put their skin in the game. They seem to think that the local population should put their skin in the game. And they promise jobs that don't show up. And I just think that whether it's state or local, federal, there's enough data out there these days that you should be able to look at other studies of other towns that have done similar things, or cities, or whatever it is you're looking at, and see how it played out. Because I think what you'll find in a lot of those cases where there was a lot of public spending that was requested, that it almost always turns out to be a bad idea.
Well, how about green energy? You talked about energy earlier.
Yeah.
One is a big recipient of subsidies. It's also, one that's mandated now by government policy and government dictates. So it's not necessarily a subsidy in the sense that they're taking money out of our pockets, although they do that for green energy. But the biggest ones is that they just mandate that you use a product. And granted, it's mandate on the utility company directly, but indirectly, it has huge implications for your utility bills down the road. So, one you looked at?
Oh yeah, we looked at we looked at all, you know, we have a whole chapter on the energy industry, and we looked at everything from, you know, solar to wind to coal to natural gas to, you know, I mean, I was surprised to learn, I thought I knew a lot about this. I was surprised to learn that we still heavily, you know, people like to complain about solar and wind energy subsidies, and there's certainly a lot to complain about, but we also subsidize the coal industry in a huge way, the nuclear energy industry in a huge way, natural gas. I mean, all of these energy sources are being, you know, subsidized. And you know, Warren Buffett said that he wouldn't be investing in solar energy if it didn't get massive subsidies. You know, so you know, he came out and said, you know, no, it's not going to be a viable industry for a very, very long time, and I'm only doing it because I get subsidized to do it, which is kind of a scary thought. We're just incentivizing, you know, bad behavior. And you're right, we are being told as consumers. I mean, you know, energy companies are being told they have to do it. So are consumers. At least in Hawaii, you can't build a new home anymore without putting solar on it. So you don't have a choice anymore. You have to put solar panels on your home, any new construction. And I think other states, I think California might be headed that way too. So it's no longer a choice. And sure, we all want a cleaner environment. Absolutely. I mean, I went to the, you know, coal country, and I didn't really meet a lot of people that were crazy about bringing back coal in a big way, you know. But subsidies aren't necessarily the way to go.
Yeah, well, in California, I know that they are mandating that a lot of new construction happen without natural gas hookups in the home. So it's another mandate. And, you know, I get it. It's not a direct welfare program for certain industry, but it's a way that the government's kind of infringing on your day-to-day rights and freedoms and choice, all those kinds of things.
Right.
Any, we got just a few minutes to go. Any last words that you want to share? Any specific programs that you want to talk about real quick before we let you go?
Well, I just, you know, I mean, there's so many examples in the book that no matter what, you know, industry you're looking at, you'll probably find something to read about in there. I think that, you know, if we just stay with energy for a second, probably the most shocking story I heard was that Bill Gates has been invested in nuclear energy for a while now, and he developed he's developing a new nuclear reactor, and ended up deciding to build it in China. And then once Trump threw all those tariffs at China, they had to close up shop. And they'd been there for 12 years, you know, studying this new reactor that they're going to build. And then they had to come back to the States. And so Bill Gates went to Congress and he said, I will put, you know, $1 billion in. I have a friend who's going to put $1 billion in, and then we want the American taxpayer to also throw $1 billion into this program to, you know, study and build this new reactor. And to me, that's just, and so I went and interviewed the company. It's called TerraPower in Seattle, and asked them, you know, well, why do you need taxpayer dollars to do this? Why can't you, you know, if he knows one other billionaire, he probably knows a third one, and they could fund the whole thing themselves. Why do we have to be on the hook? And they said, you know, they had their reasons. They just, you know, well, it'll be, you know, it'll benefit research and industry and science and all that if once we did, because it's not even a real thing yet. They're still in the R&D stage. But you know, the most surprising thing was I said, oh, okay, so then American taxpayers, you know, we're going to get like cheap energy out of this. We're going to get nuclear power plants that are super safe and cheap. And they said, oh, no, we probably won't even be, you know, providing any of them in the United States. They'll probably all be built in India and China. You know, so here's the American taxpayer being asked to fund this billionaire who doesn't need our money, and then we don't even get anything for it. So to me, that's just a shocking example of how bold people are about asking for this stuff if they think they can get it.
All right. Well, thanks for your time, Lisa. Again, you have this book, Welfare for the Rich. It's available August the 4th, so it's coming out soon, and you can find out more about it, more nuggets and various information at welfarefortherich.com. Thanks for your time, and I know we have tentative plans for you to come out and speak at events here. We're working through the whole COVID-19 situation, but I know we've got some pretty concrete plans, so we're excited about that as well. And again, thanks again. So thanks for listening to this week's show. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.